Stranger and Stranger, a Generation X based fic. Chapter 4, Backfire. The second Richard heard the announcement, as well as noticed the change in the lighting, he knew what had been happening. It didn't make sense for Godiva to shut the museum down since it wasn't officially open. Somehow things had switched to something that worked in Emplate's favor. For now, he had to give them an advantage, since to him it was obvious that Emplate knew where they were. In response, he turned to look at the camera and figured that Emplate was looking right at them. He reacted by letting Yvette go, turning his hands into claws and slashing at the device. He momentarily felt bad about it, knowing Godiva would have to replace the camera, but they would need some secrecy to prepare themselves. Once he had destroyed the camera, Yvette walked over to him, and he could hear the concern in her voice as she asked, "What's going on?" He was certain that she already suspected the same thing he had, and was no doubt seeking confirmation about it. He momentarily glanced at his watch and then shook his head. It wouldn't mean much now, since the museum wasn't fully open. Godiva may have it operating on a timetable, but with Emplate able to control things, the timing would mean nothing. They would need to prepare things to thwart Emplate's obvious plan. He started to walk to a table in the corner, answering Yvette's question in that moment. Emplate must be at the security controls, and with Aura here as well, they have a serious advantage. I think he did this because everyone is looking for us, and this must be a move to keep them separated. I would not be surprised if Emplate also knows Godiva's password, so he's going to be able to get in here at some point. Once he was at the table, he heard Yvette respond to the statement in the mind link they shared when he had her powers. "Richard, you know the second he gets in, he's going to spirit us away to his lair. What do you have in mind to stop him?" He had to commend Yvette on using the mental link. He hadn't even thought about the possibility of microphones, and them able to hear the plans. He checked the table and found that he had been right about a detail he noticed when he first entered the room. The table had a drawer, and when he opened it, he found a set of manacles. He was certain that something like this was in here, and he got them out, along with the key for them. It actually made sense, given the alternate purpose of the room. He turned to Yvette and held up the manacles. "Given what Godiva and Kyukai also used this room for, I'm betting these things are also so durable that not even your claws can cut them." He then placed one manacle on her right wrist and the other on his left wrist. He hoped she wouldn't panic, and he did sense a rise in panic in her, but then she realized what it meant. She looked at him and smiled, responding in their mental link. "If we can't break them, neither can he. It keeps us together, defeating his main reason for capturing us." He then watched as a puzzled look crossed her face. "What about the key? How are you going to hide that?" He had hoped she would ask about that. He then led the way over to another particular exhibit in the room. This particular exhibit was for the electric chair, and he had no doubt that it would be working. He noticed it was surrounded by a steel fence, and that the chair was almost flush against the wall. He took a moment to reach his hand into the fence and give the key a throw. To his delight, the key landed on the seat and slid across it to fall on the floor behind it. There would be no way to reach the key, or at least for Emplate or Aura to reach it, especially after he turned on the electric chair. Once he did so, he said to Yvette, "There, with the key behind that chair in a way that they have to touch the thing while it's live, We have extra protection. He then wrecked the console and was glad that the thing was still humming with energy. He turned and led them away from the electric chair display and looked around the room. As he did so, he heard Yvette respond to this change in things. "That is brilliant. I'm sure once M-Plate and Nora are gone, they can get us out of these manacles. Won't Godiva be mad about the destruction, though?" Yvette had a very good point, but he was sure Sean and Emma knew someone who'd help repair the system. He looked around the room again while answering her question. "I would hope so. You can't set up a complex like we have at the school and not know someone extremely tech-savvy. Given this whole situation, I'm sure the X-Men would give some help." Richard then spotted something which could be a great hiding spot for them. He quickly led her over to a replica of a set of gallows in the exhibit room. As they climbed up onto the exhibit, Yvette asked him a serious question. "Richard, will that kill them if they try to get the key?" He shook his head. He figured the worst that would happen would be they could get knocked unconscious. Before he could answer the question, Yvette realized what he was thinking for a hiding place. "Oh, are we going to hide in the base of this thing?" He nodded as he opened the trapdoor in the gallows. "Exactly. Hopefully the base obscures us enough so he won't see us right away." He then carefully climbed down, while at the same time helping her get down there. Once they were underneath, he worked to close the trapdoor. Once it was closed, they noticed how dark the place was, especially with the place on reduced lighting. He also started to realize how confined the place was. If it weren't such a creepy place, it could be cozy. As it were, it was difficult for them to be sitting next to each other. In fact, he started to figure it would be easier for them to lay down. He motioned to Yvette and said, "I think it will be easier to lay down in here. It is a bit cramped to be sitting up here." As he started to lay down, he saw Yvette doing the same. As she did so, he heard her ask, "Will you be able to hold me as we lay here? This room still creeps me out." He completely understood, and after a few moments he worked his arms around her. It actually made him feel a bit better to be holding her close to him. Despite the morbid setting of the place, with the relative security they had in this hiding space, it did seem a safe place. They had also taken enough precautions to make sure they couldn't be separated too easily. He just hoped the others would figure out where they were before M-Plate made it into the room. In fact, it was enough to make them both relax so much they felt her falling asleep. Soon, he joined her in that sleep. Cartier St. Croix was both confused and seriously concerned by what was happening. He was certain Marius was behind all these events, but he was also hoping that Marius was in the dark about the truth of the Cale family. Ever since he was made aware of Richard Cale Jr.'s powers, it had only increased his fears from when he learned of Marius's dark fate. Should his son get control of the young Cale, it would be a disaster. He started to search for the switch that would allow them to get out of the exhibit room. He had already known about the security measure, but he didn't know all the switch locations. As he searched for the switch out of the exhibit room, he said to his daughter, "Monet, help me find the switch to get out of this room. We need to stop Marius." He was taken back when he heard her respond, "No, why would I want to do that?" He turned to look at her and the look on her face caused a chill to go down his spine. She had a wicked smile on her face, and he knew Monet was not capable of that. Her twin sister, however, was capable of it. In his mind, he was already preparing to do something to counter the being he now faced. He remained calm as he first said, "Claudette." He wondered how long she was in control of the body the twins inhabited. He knew the mutant named Gateway was mentoring Monet and controlling the evil twin, but it led to the occasional autistic attacks. He also had a feeling that it was during the recent attack that she might have informed Marius that Richard and Yvette had gone somewhere. He kept his eyes on his daughter as she then smirked at him. "You finally realized I've been in control since our last attack. You know, he didn't move from his hiding spot until I told him Yvette had left that little gathering place we were all in. That bit of information distressed him, since it told him that she was already observing things when not in control. The only plus to that was that Monet could be doing the same thing at the moment. He hoped she was trying to fight back and regain control of the joint form. But right now, if he kept her talking, it would keep Claudette from doing any more to help Marius. Well, I doubt he's going to be able to get at either of them, even if he knows where they are. Besides, Monet's friends will stop him. He heard her laugh and wanted to lash out. The only thing keeping him from doing that was the fact that he'd end up hurting Monet in the process. He was tempted, however, when Claudette then said, "I highly doubt that. They still don't know how much I've been helping him over the years. It was I who told him about Yvette, and let him know Yvette was now at the school. Don't you remember the trip to Yugoslavia?" He recalled that trip from years ago. While they were there, he had been asked to check on the girl by Richard's father. It had been a short time after they initially defeated Claudette and Marius when they had been merged. However, to hear she had been the reason that Marius found out about Yvette in the first place pained him. He tried to remain calm as he said, "Yes, I do remember that trip. So you've been helping him find victims." He didn't want to say more, since he figured the relationship is what drew his son's attention to Richard. He watched as she laughed again, and then she said something that started to worry him even more. "You could say that. You know, Richard's powers are interesting. But there is something about him that is curious. He was able to detect our nature, and I can't help but think there is something more about him. Something about him seems—" He then saw the shared form collapse to the floor. That was good, since it spared him from having to explain the connection. He didn't want to do that until he had some time to speak with Richard's father. After a brief moment, he saw his daughter grab her head and scream, "I will not let you stay in control and have caused chaos." He walked over to her as she recovered from everything that she must have endured. When he was close enough, he saw her look right at him and asked, "What all has happened? Claudette managed to take control when Godiva said what she said." Cartier helped her get up as he answered her question. "A good deal, which includes your brother having separated all of us, and possibly going after Richard and Yvette. This is more problematic than you can imagine." He wanted to say more, but he wasn't sure how much Claudette would be processing. He then calmly said, "You'll need to keep her in check. Remember what happened the last time Claudette took control when Marius was around." He saw she was about to respond to the statement, but then he heard her communicator come to life. He watched as she activated it, and when he did, he heard some bad news coming from the young boy known as Leech. By the sound of it, Marius was making his move. M-Plate had entered the secret door for the Inner Earth exhibit. He did this just as Elaine made her way to the top of the steps to do her part of keeping Generation X from getting into the correct exhibit. He then made his way over to the door. He knew that the duo known as Artie and Leech wouldn't attempt to attack him. Artie really didn't have any offensive capabilities with his powers, and he figured Leech wasn't sure that his power would affect him. As he expected, he heard the beep of one of the Generation X communicators coming to life. They were probably relaying the news of his movements to the others. In the process, they will all learn where Richard and Yvette had gone to hide. Of course, by the time they figured it out, it would be too late. He would have already spirited the duo away. His plan had worked almost perfectly. He figured they would go to this exhibit once they came down here, since it was the most secure room. He reached the door and quickly keyed in the password and entered the exhibit room. Once he was in, he closed the door and reprogrammed the password. He purposefully picked random letters and numbers. That way, no one would get in that way any time soon. He anticipated there may be some difficulties, but nothing that would delay him too much. The first difficulty would be finding where they were hidden in here. He wasn't going to let the sounds of the room bother him. In fact, it brought a smile to his face. He then started to check possible hiding spots around the door area. In all truth, he didn't expect them near the door, but he wasn't going to rule it out. He would not put it past them to try and bolt out the door once he was looking away from it. To his own relief, as well as his own figuring, he didn't hear them bolting for the other door. He then ventured further into the exhibit, scanning the room for possible hiding spots. As he did so, he almost reacted when he heard a crackle. He then glanced in the direction and was almost cross with himself for reacting to the ruined camera. He had to admit that the sparks had surprised him. That would be a problem if it slowed down his search. Marius almost thought about demanding they reveal themselves and give up, but he figured they wouldn't do that. Most likely they were hiding somewhere to prolong their safety. It wouldn't work, as he took a moment to look around using his own powers. Once he did so, he noticed 2 auras in the exhibit for the gallows. He started over to the exhibit saying, "Very clever, you two. A shame it didn't work as a good hiding spot." He made his way over to the display and made his way to where the trapdoor had to be. Once he opened it, he looked down at his prey and inwardly smiled. He had to at least admire Yvette's current attire. Still, with her abilities, he preferred her to be in the restraints. He would have to make some of them stronger than before, since she had obviously learned more control over her abilities. He then took a moment to contemplate his plans for Richard Cale. Once he had the young man separated from Yvette and her abilities wore off, he'd turn him into a second M-Plate. The powers this young man had would be very helpful in his plans. He already had something planned to keep him close to him, so he could lock his powers on to Richard Cale. Still, after that first encounter, there was a nagging feeling in him that they had some sort of deeper connection, one he wanted to get to the bottom of. M-Plate started to lengthen his dreadlocks while he still had Godiva's powers. Once he used them to get his prey out, He'd phase out of sync with the current dimension with them and escape with them. It wouldn't be long once his dreadlocks wrapped around them. In fact, this had been his best plan yet. A complete victory over Generation X. The two had obviously fallen asleep since they hadn't moved at all when he discovered them. No doubt all their worry had exhausted them. He had to even note that Richard was holding a vet in an obvious loving embrace. Well, that embrace was going to go away once he had them out of there. Once they were out of that area, however, he noticed there was more to the embrace than love. To his dismay, Richard had taken one precaution that he hadn't taken into account. The manacles on the couple's wrist were something he hadn't figured were in the room. He was aware of the other purpose of this exhibit, and even realized that these manacles might be tough enough to prevent them from being cut too easily. This meant he would have to figure out how to get them off before he left with them. He contemplated trying to use his hair to pick the locks, but if these were designed to withstand Godiva's hair, that probably wouldn't work. No doubt there was a key to the manacles, and Richard would have hidden it someplace that would be hard to access. With this room, that could be one of many hiding places. He didn't think he'd have time to search all over the room before someone got in. He'd actually be surprised if Generation X was completely stymied by Elaine. This meant he would have to get them to say where they hid the key. It was then he laid his sight on another item in the room, and it made him smile. This would be the thing that would allow him to get the information out of them. It would probably give them a good deal of discomfort, since he was aware of Yvette's healing factor, but it would still serve the purpose the device was made for. He took the still sleeping couple and smiled as he said, "You won't be sleeping much longer, and you'll both wake up telling me where the key to the manacles is." He then started to hook the sleeping couple up to the working replica of the rack. Emma Frost had listened intently while Leech relayed what Emplate had done and where he had entered. It inwardly puzzled her why Emplate was heading in the Inhumanities exhibit, since none of them figured Richard and Yvette was in there. It made no sense to her. Then she heard a loud slap, and she looked over at Godiva, who had slapped her own forehead, as if she just realized something. Emma tried to remain calm as she asked, "Did you realize something, Godiva?" She watched as Godiva started to turn red, as if the thought she had just come to was a bit embarrassing to her. In fact, she saw Godiva look down a bit as she said, "Well, that particular exhibit actually had an alternative use. One I think I may have mentioned to Richard once or twice after he first went to college. It was my curiosity about some alternative lifestyles. So when I set up the museum, Kyukai and I set up the room for those alternate usage." Emma now started to understand things, although she was a little surprised by this. While her time in the Hellfire Club did show her some of these alternate lifestyles, she had indulged in some, but not to this extent. She did have to give Godiva some credit for even hiding it in plain sight. She also realized what certain measures were most likely taken with the room. "So you also made sure the room was extra secure in all ways?" She saw Godiva nod and heard the girl explain it. "Yes, First off, it isn't connected to the secret passages. We also have it shielded so no communications can get in the room. We do have speakers and cameras linked to the security system, but we also made sure we could turn them off. Finally, the security doors have passwords on them to open them. Each one is set to a password one of us selected. As Godiva said all that, Emma was quickly processing all that information. All in the sake of privacy, Godiva and Kyukai had set up a fortress in the museum. The most disturbing room was set up almost as a panic room. She even realized that Richard must have figured that out, and in turn let Yvette know. So, if Emplate and Oro were at the security console, they would have known where the two had gone. She then realized one last thing, and asked, "Let me guess. The door that Emplate entered was the one set with your password." She was almost hit with a wave of despair when Godiva confirmed it with a nod, and added, "And we are on the wrong side of the room, since the door we are close to is Kyukai's. I should have insisted on us being on the other side." She noticed that Godiva was starting to get upset with herself. Emma had a feeling Godiva would start to blame herself if anything happened to Richard and Yvette, so she had to think fast to find some way of comforting the girl. Even in the past few months, she had seen Richard demonstrate quick thinking, as well as some deductive reasoning when it came to those plans. She looked at Godiva and asked, "Godiva, how durable are those things in the room?" One of Yvette's powers is to tense her skin up to cut almost anything. We had to get some special material just to preserve her clothing and uniform. She saw Godiva pause in a moment, possibly delaying a panic attack. "Well, they weren't cheap to make. We had to put some funds into making them durable to withstand my hair. Hell, I haven't had a haircut in years since most blades get ruined by it." She heard a slight laugh come from Godiva before the girl realized something. "Wait a minute. Do you think Richard could have realized that about things? I know he had some hidden stuff in there, for—" She trailed off, but Emma figured what Godiva was about to suggest. She just nodded and said, "Yes, I think he's aware of that and took those into account. I would not be surprised if Richard might have found something to make sure he and Yvette can't be separated from one another. Most likely, I'd assume, he found something like manacles and put them on. He might have even done something with the key." She noticed Godiva had calmed down a bit after hearing all that. She then watched as Godiva started to check the exhibits. "Thank you for saying that. Now we need to find the switch to open the secret door." She watched as Godiva started to search the first exhibit she came to. Emma decided to do the same, but did a brief double take when she saw the exhibit she was closest to. Before she could even check it, she heard Godiva ask, "Emma, can you tell me what happened when Elaine attacked the school?" Emma paused for a moment. She knew she had to be careful how much she said, so she didn't reveal anything about the truth of Daria that would contradict what they said already. At least she could keep it simple. "Well, at the time she attacked, only Richard and Yvette and Paige had been at the school. It had been the day we were going to receive Daria, but unfortunately Richard had a nightmare the night before." She heard Godiva sigh as she responded to that statement. "Nightmares are never a good sign in our family. They always seem to be an omen of something bad coming. I once had a nightmare involving my parents, myself, and my brother all exploding. The day after, my father committed suicide." Emma nearly gasped when she heard that, since she had been one of the few people to actually see what happened to him. Emma then continued as she continued her search. Well, it was, but it also a help. It was how we knew that Elaine was going to attack, not that Richard wanted to mention her name right away. While we were out, she had broken in, literally crushing Paige's waist when she had made her outer layer steel, or something similar. They had managed to keep Elaine guessing until she managed to catch up to them. They were unconscious when we got back. In that moment, Emma started feeling a bit lightheaded, not sure what was happening. It was as if something was trying to break through her psychic defenses. It only got worse when she heard Godiva ask, "Who stopped Elaine then?" Emma wanted to answer the question, but at that moment she was hit with what was trying to break through her psychic defenses. At first she couldn't make it out, but then she realized what it was. It was Richard and Yvette screaming in pain. It was so intense that it made her physically stagger and bump the display she had been standing next to. As she did so, she had also closed her eyes to bear the pain as she said, "Damn, Emplate must have found them, and now he's torturing them." She heard Godiva run over to her side and felt her try to steady her. As Godiva did so, she heard the girl say, "Something tells me that is both good and bad. It's bad that he's torturing them, but it means Richard thought up something that stymied him." Emma only nodded, since that psychic scream took a toll on her. She then heard Godiva say, "On a plus, you found the trigger to the secret door. I guess you bumped the trigger on the Tay Ruxpin doll." That statement actually made Emma open her eyes in surprise, and she wondered what the old toy had to do with hauntings, but decided not to ask as rescuing Richard and Yvette was most important. Daria almost jumped when Emma and Godiva came through the secret panel in the wall. With everything happening like it was, she had been half expecting Aura to attack them. With how much her life had changed, and in such quick succession, from being pulled into zero tolerance and then joining Generation X, it was tricky to keep track of everything that had happened. It was still hard to believe she was now in a mission to save her new guardian and the woman he loved from the entity known as Emplate. So far, the only others to come through the secret door had been Jubilation, Everett, Monet, and her father. Mondo, in his continued optimism, smiled and said, "Good of you all to join us. Given what has been happening, I've been trying to keep people calm." She had to admit Mondo was good at that. When each of the others had entered the room, one of them seemed to have collapsed, causing the door to close again. She watched as Godiva kept herself near the door and heard her ask, "I take it all of you made their way here and didn't keep this door open." Naria looked at the others, and they had nodded. She then saw Godiva say, "Another failsafe, just in case of thieves." She heard Jubilation let out a sigh as she said, "Would have been nice to know that before, but it makes sense in a strategic way. Still, this improves our chances of saving Richard and Penny, doesn't it, Miss Frost?" Daria could tell Jubilation was worried when she said that. In her short time with the group, she had learned that Jubilation would normally refer to Emma as Frosty or something similar. She heard Miss Frost answer that question with a slightly drained tone in her voice. "Yes, this does. However, it appears that Emplate has started torturing them in there. We are going to need to get into the next room, and quickly. We've already concluded that they are in the exhibit room devoted to all those torture methods and such." Daria was still surprised when she heard that they had all been in there. She heard Everett echo her concerns when he said, "It doesn't make sense why they would hide in there. We all saw how Yvette reacted in there." She heard Godiva respond, "Let's just say he figured the room was the most secure in the place. He figured it out due to facts he deduced about me." She saw Godiva shake her head and was about to say something else. Before anyone could say anything more, Daria heard Monet say, "It might be best if we get to the next room. I think Jonathan and Paige got that room, and whatever my brother is putting Richard and Yvette through, it may have a serious effect on Jonah." This statement made her pause. She saw Emma nod as well as look over at Monet with something like a questioning look. "Monet is correct. I am curious how you are handling the psychic screams. It nearly floored me. I can't even begin to fathom how it's affecting Jonah being in the next room." Daria decided at that point that they should be moving on to the other room. She headed to the secret passage, saying, "Then we better get over there. We may even need to move Jonah away from the room." She found herself leading the group into the secret passage and to the next room, the one before the steps that led up to the living section. It was a short walk, but once they were at the door, Daria opened the door and was shocked by the sight in front of her. Paige was kneeling over Jonathan, and she could see the psychic fire that took up most of his code name's namesake was very dim. While she was aware of what caused this, Daria couldn't help herself from asking, "Paige, what happened?" She saw the worry in the girl's face as she answered the question. "I don't fully know. Before he collapsed to the ground, he said he couldn't take their screams. Is it something Richard and Yvette are causing, or something Emplate is doing?" She heard Emma answer the question. "Emplate is torturing Skits and Penance. They are obviously screaming and doing so on a psychic level. I've got my defenses up, but it is still giving me a headache. Husk, Jubilee, and Sync, get Chamber to the farthest room from here." She watched as the three did as she said, and went and got him out of the room. Once that was done, Daria went over to the door to the next room and noticed it had a console for a passcode on it. As she looked at it, she heard Emma say, "Godiva, you said Kyukai knows the code for that door, correct?" That made her pause, realizing that they weren't any closer to getting into the room than they had when Emma and Godiva arrived in the room. She heard Godiva answer the question. "Yes, could you use your power to ask her for it, Emma?" Daria that thought that was a plan, but wondered if it could work with Skits and Penance letting out psychic screams of pain. She saw Emma shake her head. "I don't think it is worth trying. If they let out another psychic scream while I'm doing that, it might cause pain to Kyukai." She shook her head when she said that. "I'm not sure how reliable the comms will be as well. We may have to get her to the door or within earshot of the steps." Daria nodded at that, and then looked down at her own hands. She wondered if she could use brute force to open the door, but then thought better of it. If she damaged the door, they might not be able to open the door. She then tried to turn her fingers into wires and watched with delight as she was able to do it. She then said, "I have an idea. While you try to get Kyukai, I'll try to use my power to somehow bypass the password mechanism." As she said that, she started to extend the wires, trying to find a groove in the door. She heard Emma respond to that. "That is a good—" The way Emma's voice trailed off, she was sure there had been another psionic scream. She looked over in the direction of Emma and saw she had fallen to the floor. She dared another glance and saw the same had happened to Monet. In that moment, they all knew what they had to do. She then realized how bad this was, as when she went to look at her task, the wire she had turned her fingertips into had snapped back into her hand. Richard had been having a nice dream. It was nice to have one of them every once in a while. What was even better was the fact that Yvette was also with him in the dream, like they could share their dreams when he had her powers. This dream, he had hoped, would be a glimpse into their future as they were getting married. His family and Generation X were there. Sean had walked Yvette down the aisle. It had all been beautiful. Just as the dream would have reached the ceremony, it all went to hell. The pastor had turned into M-Plate and the pain had started. He and Yvette had collapsed to the ground and Yvette was once again in her restraints. He had also now had M-Plate's powers imposed on him. He was also racked in pain. When he glanced at his hands in the dream, he saw the signs of being M-Plate's thrall. Even a glance at Yvette showed him that she too had the mouths on her hands. He had closed his eyes, hoping to wake from the nightmare. When he did, it was to see the ceiling in the Inhumanities exhibit room. They were no longer in their hiding place, but a quick glance to his side told him that he and Yvette were still shackled together. He also saw the source of their pain. They were both attached to the rack display and being subjected to its purpose. He didn't have to think too hard to figure out who was operating it. He did notice that the pulling stopped, giving them a brief respite. Although another quick glance at Yvette told him that she hadn't opened her eyes yet, but they were full of tears, no doubt from the pain. He also noticed movement and tried to follow it for a moment. As he expected, he saw M-Plate walk into view, almost looming over the two of them. The only relief he could see in this moment was that M-Plate was thwarted by the manacles. When M-Plate stopped, he could see a bit of anger in the fiend's eyes, although the voice didn't hint at that anger. "I suppose I should commend you for this one little obstacle in my plans. Of course, I've had to resort to this method to find out where the key is for those manacles. Such trivial knowledge is something I can't glean with my talents. One answer, and this pain will be over." He didn't have to think about giving the answer M-Plate wanted. Giving that information up would damn him and Yvette to becoming pawns of the monster that held them captive. He had no desire for that, especially after having it forced on him months ago. He just hoped he could keep up some sense of bravado as he responded to the statement. "I'd be mad to tell you. I'd rather have this pain now than be like you." Richard felt a bit unnerved when M-Plate just chuckled at his statement. It was obvious to him that M-Plate didn't fully believe him. When M-Plate stopped chuckling, he heard the fiend say something that struck a nerve in him. "And will Yvette be willing to put up with the pain? Is she going to be able to withstand the pain and not reveal the location of the key?" In all honesty, he didn't think Yvette would reveal the location of the key, but he also wasn't sure if he could allow her to endure any more torment. Before he could answer, he heard Yvette respond to his statement. "This is a lot better than you constantly supping on me, M-Plate." On the inside, he was very proud of her. He wanted to give her a kiss, but with how they were restrained, as well as M-Plate being there, he couldn't do that. He then heard Yvette ask him an important question in their mental link. "Do you think the others know we are in here?" He wasn't sure how to answer, but given how everything was playing out, it was probably a good bet that they did know. He tried to not give any sign to M-Plate that they were communicating when he answered her. "I think they have figured it out. I just hope that our screams of pain haven't hurt anyone. I'm certain some of them were on the psychic level." Inwardly, he cursed that Yvette hadn't had much practice in using her psionic powers. If she had gotten more practice, they could have even relayed a message to the others without it being through intense pain. He noticed that M-Plate looked over at the door and as their foe did so, he heard Emplate say, I know that whatever method Generation X tries, they won't get through the doors. I am also aware that Godiva and Kukai are on the opposite sides of their particular doors to this room, and they won't be getting to the correct doors. Not that it would help Godiva at the moment. So where are the keys to those manacles? The question was punctuated by Emplate turning to face them again. Richard didn't feel worried about that, even though he had an idea of why Emplate wasn't concerned. Still, he was certain they could hold out until the others got into the room, and he was going to let Emplate know he felt they could. He looked right at Emplate and shouted, Up yours! He took pleasure in the fact that his response made his captor startle backwards. After a moment, he saw a glint in Emplate's eyes as the fiend just calmly said, Maybe a slight break is in order. It is very possible that this torment is not enough to loosen your tongue on this matter. I think I may have to allow my beloved Elaine to have at you two for a moment. That comment worried him, not because he figured Elaine was here already, but because it meant she would have the ability to enter the room. He also didn't doubt that she'd torture them worse than what Emplate was doing. He then heard Emplate say, As for now. In that moment he saw one of Emplate's hands approaching his head. He noticed the same over Yvette's head. He heard her say in their mental link, Oh no, he's going to. She cut off in a psychic scream at the same time he felt what had to be 1,000 knives cutting into him. He even let out a psychic scream at the same time as he felt as if something was being pulled out of him. The pain almost made him want to reveal the location of the key. After a moment, the pain stopped, and he felt a trickle of blood on his forehead. He even had trouble focusing on what was before him. Eventually, it came into focus again as the pain passed. Once that happened, he started to wonder if he had doomed himself and Yvette by coming to this room in the first place. He felt momentary relief when he heard Yvette say in their mental link, I managed to do it. I managed to stay strong during that. I didn't give in. He looked over at her and saw her look at him. The pain she endured could be seen on her face, especially as some blood appeared to trickle down her forehead. He did see a weak smile on her face and noticed her chest rose and fell almost like she had actually screamed aloud. It gave him some comfort due to the situation they were in. He then tried to look for Emplate, but given their situation he couldn't. He then moved his hand to take Yvette's and was glad he'd been able to. It gave him some hope, even though his words were those of fear. I know, but can we last until Generation X gets in here? He's confident Elaine can get in, and if that is the case, our odds of going home with Generation X may drop to nil. I just hope I'm wrong. He felt her squeeze his hand, and in that he felt her hope as well. He truly hoped he was wrong about their most likely fate at this point, and he felt pending guilt that it would be his fault. Darrett made his way cautiously through the secret passage they had found in the library. As they continued down it, he asked his mother the question that was on his mind as they neared the end of their journey. Mother, what will this thing do once we find it, and why is it here? His mother calmly responded to the question. From what we were able to find out, it is a mystic relic known as Time's Circle. Apparently, it can allow someone to travel back in time and change a key point. The only problem is that where and whenever it appears, only the right person can use it. Given the history of Richard's family, they must have been somehow directed to it, and they brought it here. No doubt in their state of mind they realized it could undo them. That made Darrett let out a noise of disgust, but it turned into one of awe when he saw the room they reached. He couldn't believe all the items in the room, and part of him wondered if they would be able to find the item that they sought in here. As he ventured further into the room, he asked the key question. Mom, how did we even find out about this item? And where are we going to find it in here? As he started to look around, he heard her response to his question. Those travelers who got split up when they arrived. They said they had an idea where it was, but because the others had captured the one who could help them travel away from here, they had to find them. That's how we found out about it. They said it was the only way to save this timeline. Something about that made him wonder what exactly needed to be done that would save the timeline. It didn't even make sense given how they could save this timeline. Unless they killed the leaders of the M plates before they came to power. He shook his head, also looking from side to side to find the item. The various items in this room boggled his mind since they seemed so powerful. They also seemed to be so out of character for the fiends to have there. A good portion of the things he was seeing could have been used to defeat them. He even doubted that all of these things could have been brought together in the years since the events had happened. He was about to ask his mother where the item might be when he spotted it. The item looked like a glowing hoop. As he got closer to it, he could tell it looked like a snake that was eating its own tail. He could even sense the power coming from it. This relic could stop everything from happening as it had. He was about to call his mother over when he heard a gasp, and he knew it wasn't good. He turned and was shocked by what he saw. His mother was looking down at her chest with what looked like 4 blades sticking through it. Behind her he saw the crazed look of a red-headed woman behind his mother. On the other side of the crazed woman was her mate. They were 2 figures he knew about all too well, and even now he couldn't believe they had ever been good people. It even unnerved him when the redhead said, "She was the last of Generation X, and the last of all resistance. Right, my dear?" He watched almost frozen in place as he saw the male look at him with what had to be a neutral expression on his face. When the man spoke, he just heard him calmly say, "Yes, Yvette, she was. And this young man is the last one who opposes us." Deep down, Darrett felt his life was over when he heard Richard Cale say that. Still, something in him told him there was still a chance.